The handcuffs clicked shut around the man's wrists in the middle of a crowded parking lot. A female officer stood before him, her voice sharp, her authority absolute. He did not resist. He did not explain. He only pulled his sleeve down as she pushed him toward the patrol car. But in that moment, the fabric shifted. An old tattoo appeared on his forearm, faded, deliberate, unmistakable. The officer froze. Her eyes changed, and the question hung heavy in the air. Who was this man, and what had the system just done terribly wrong? If you have ever believed that justice sometimes arrives late but never arrives without meaning, stay with this story until the very end. His name was Daniel Mercer, and until that Thursday afternoon, his life had followed an invisible schedule that no one else could see. Wake at 5:45. Coffee by 6. Leave by 6:30. Clock in by 7. Every minute accounted for. Every task assigned its proper time. There was no room for spontaneity in his world, because spontaneity cost things he could not afford to lose. Daniel had learned that lesson the hard way, 9 years ago, when everything he loved was taken from him in a single phone call. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant outside Richmond, Virginia. He had been there for 11 years longer than most of the managers, longer than most of the executives. He never asked for promotions. He never complained about overtime. He never drew attention to himself in any way that might invite questions he was not prepared to answer. He simply showed up, did what was needed, and left without fanfare. That was the agreement he had made with himself after his wife died. Keep your head down. Keep moving. Keep Sophie safe. That Thursday, the company had scheduled an off-site equipment inspection at a facility near the airport. Daniel drove the company van, parked in the designated lot, and waited for the rest of the team. He had been standing near the van for less than 10 minutes when the patrol car pulled in. The officer who stepped out was Captain Elena Shaw of the Richmond Metro Police. She had received a call about a suspicious individual matching his general description near a vehicle reported stolen 2 days prior. The van Daniel drove was not the stolen vehicle, but it was close enough in color and make to warrant a stop, at least according to the dispatcher who relayed the information. She approached him with procedure in her posture and suspicion in her eyes. Badge visible, hand resting near her holster, voice loud enough for the gathering witnesses to hear. Daniel answered her questions calmly. He showed his ID without hesitation. He explained his purpose for being there. He pointed to the company logo on the side of the van and offered to call his supervisor for verification. But Elena Shaw was not interested in explanations. She was interested in protocol. The registration check came back slow, the system lagging in the afternoon heat. A flag appeared, a mismatch between the vehicle identification number and the registered owner. A clerical error from when the company had updated its fleet 6 months prior. It was nothing, a paperwork delay that any reasonable person could have resolved with a phone call. But in that window of uncertainty, while the system churned and the witnesses gathered, Elena made a decision that would change both of their lives. She told him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Daniel complied without protest. His face revealed nothing, not anger, not fear, not even surprise, only the quiet tension of a man who understood that resistance would make everything worse, and that worse was something he could not afford. People gathered at the edge of the parking lot. Phones appeared from pockets and purses. Murmurs spread through the small crowd like ripples across still water. Elena secured the cuffs with practiced efficiency. She recited his rights in a voice that carried across the lot. She placed her hand firmly on his shoulder and guided him toward her patrol vehicle. And then Daniel said the only thing he had said since the encounter began. "I need to make a call by 3:15. Elena paused. "You'll get your phone call at the station. That will be too late." She studied him carefully. His voice had not risen. His body had not tensed against the restraints, but something in his eyes, something sharp and desperate and achingly vulnerable, flickered for just a second before disappearing behind a wall of composure. "What's at 3:15? She asked, her curiosity momentarily overriding her training. He did not answer. She noted his refusal as suspicious behavior and tightened her grip on his arm. She continued toward the patrol car without another word. She did not know what 3:15 meant. She did not ask again, and in that heavy silence between them, the first hairline crack in her certainty began to form, though she would not recognize it for what it was until much later, when the damage had already been done. At the station, Daniel Mercer was processed like any other detainee. Fingerprints taken. Photographs snapped from multiple angles. Personal effects cataloged and sealed in a manila envelope. His wallet contained $47 in cash, a library card with a coffee stain in one corner, and a photograph so worn at the edges it had begun to curl inward, as if trying to protect whatever image it held from the fluorescent lights overhead. The booking officer noted everything with routine disinterest, his pen moving across the form with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. But when he reached Daniel's left forearm, his pen stopped. "What's this?" he asked, gesturing toward the tattoo partially visible beneath Daniel's rolled sleeve. Daniel glanced down at the faded ink as if seeing it for the first time. A simple design, a shield bisected by a single vertical line, with 2 small letters beneath it. Letters that meant nothing to the untrained eye, but everything to those who knew their significance. "Old marking," Daniel said quietly. "From another life." The booking officer shrugged and moved on to the next field, but something about the image lingered in the room like smoke, and when the completed paperwork reached Elena Shaw's desk 20 minutes later, she found herself staring at the photograph of that tattoo longer than she should have. She had seen that symbol before. She was certain of it. She could not remember where. Sergeant Marcus Cole, a veteran of 23 years on the force, with gray temples and lines carved deep around his eyes, passed her desk on his way to the break room. He paused when he saw the image on her screen, something shifting in his expression. "Where'd you pick this guy up?" he asked. "Airport lot. Vehicle match on a theft report." Turned out to be a clerical error with the registration. Marcus leaned closer to the screen, his coffee forgotten in his hand. His expression shifted from curiosity to something harder to read. "That tattoo," he said slowly, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "You know what that is?" "No. It's a unit marker, Federal Task Force, joint operations out of Quantico, deep cover stuff, the kind they don't talk about at press conferences. I saw it once, maybe 15 years ago, during a cross-agency coordination meeting. They don't use it anymore, disbanded the program after budget cuts and political reshuffling, but anyone who wore that ink earned it the hard way." Elena felt a cold knot begin to form in her chest, tightening with each breath. "Earned it how?" "Deep cover. Long-term infiltration. The kind of work that doesn't make the news because it's not supposed to exist. Years undercover with no backup, no safety net, no guarantee of coming home." Marcus straightened and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You sure this guy's actually a suspect?" Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at the photograph again, the quiet face, the still posture, the eyes that had revealed nothing even when the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "The system flagged the vehicle," she said finally, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. "I followed protocol." "Protocol's fine," Marcus said, setting his coffee down on her desk. "But protocol doesn't tell you who someone really is, only what they look like on paper. And paper can lie." "Oh." He walked away without another word, leaving her alone with the image on her screen. Elena sat in the growing silence, the symbol staring back at her like an accusation she had not yet learned to understand. She had made the arrest by the book. She had followed every rule, checked every box, done everything exactly as she had been trained to do. And yet, for the first time since joining the force 12 years ago, she found herself wondering if the book itself was the problem, or if she had failed to see something deeper that the book had never been designed to capture. Elena requested Daniel Mercer's full background file the next morning, arriving at the station an hour before her shift was scheduled to begin. What came back was not what she expected. There were no charges anywhere in his history. no arrests, no disciplinary flags from any employer. His work history showed 11 years at the same manufacturing company, with steady promotions offered and consistently declined, raises accepted only when mandated by company policy. His credit was clean. His taxes were filed on time every year without exception. His address had not changed in 9 years, the same small house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Richmond. On paper, Daniel Mercer was practically invisible, the kind of person who moved through the world without leaving ripples. But deeper in the file, buried beneath the ordinary details and routine notations, was a series of entries that made Elena pause, her coffee growing cold in her hand. Declined transfer to corporate headquarters, cited family obligations. Declined enrollment in management training program, cited scheduling conflicts. End quote. Declined relocation incentive with significant salary increase, cited personal circumstances. Every opportunity he had been offered over the past 9 years, he had turned down. Not because he lacked ambition or ability, his performance reviews were consistently excellent, but because something else came first, something that mattered more than career advancement or financial gain. Elena leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen until the words began to blur. She thought about his words in the parking lot, spoken with such quiet desperation. "I need to make a call by 3:15. She thought about the way his eyes had flickered with something vulnerable before the wall came back up. She thought about the tattoo, the faded ink of a life no one at that police station had thought to ask him about. She pulled up a different database, one that required authorization she technically possessed but rarely used, a federal records access portal that most local officers never touched. The results loaded slowly, the progress bar crawling across her screen. Daniel Mercer had served in federal law enforcement for 7 years before leaving the agency without public explanation. His service record was partially redacted, entire sections blacked out with the kind of thoroughness that suggested classified operations. His final assignment was marked with a code she did not recognize. His departure from the agency was listed as voluntary, but the date coincided with a personal tragedy noted in a separate civilian file. His wife, Margaret, had died 9 years ago. Cancer, the kind that moved fast and showed no mercy. She had been 34 years old. They had a daughter together, Sophie, age 9 now. Elena closed her eyes and pressed her palms against them until she saw stars. She understood now. All of it. 3:15 was not a meeting. It was not a work deadline or an appointment with a lawyer. It was a pickup time, a school bus dropping off a 9-year-old girl who had already lost her mother and who waited each afternoon for a father who always came on time because he had promised her that he would never be late. Daniel Mercer had not resisted arrest because he could not afford to escalate a situation that might keep him away from his daughter even longer. He had not explained himself because explanation would have meant exposing something more vulnerable than his pride. It would have meant admitting weakness in front of strangers with cameras. He had stayed silent to protect his child from becoming part of the spectacle, and Elena had taken that silence as evidence of guilt. She sat in her office for a long time after that, the weight of the file pressing against her chest like a verdict she had not been prepared to receive. She had followed protocol. She had done her job exactly as trained. She had made the arrest cleanly, professionally, without excessive force or improper procedure. And yet, she had humiliated a man in front of strangers who recorded his worst moment on their phones. She had denied him a phone call that might have been the only thing standing between his daughter and an empty sidewalk. She had treated his composure as guilt instead of recognizing it for what it truly was: discipline forged in years of service, of protecting others, of keeping impossible promises. The system had cleared him within hours. The charges had been dropped before dinner. The paperwork had been filed and forgotten, but Elena knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones, that some things could not be undone by paperwork alone. Elena tried to call Daniel that evening. He did not answer. She left a message brief, professional, carefully worded to avoid sounding like either an apology or an excuse. She asked if he would be willing to meet and discuss what had happened. She said she wanted to understand. She did not apologize in the voicemail, because she knew an apology delivered to a machine would mean nothing at all. 2 days passed without response. Then 3. On the 4th day, her commanding officer called her into his office. Lieutenant Harold Vance was a man who measured words like currency, spending them only when necessary, and never wasting them on pleasantries. He did not smile when Elena entered. He did not offer her a seat. He simply gestured toward the chair across from his desk and waited for her to sit. "The Mercer arrest," he began without preamble. "Internal Affairs has opened a formal review." Elena kept her expression carefully neutral. "On what grounds?" "Unnecessary detention, failure to verify vehicle registration discrepancy before escalating to physical restraint, public exposure of a citizen without sufficient probable cause." He paused, letting each accusation land. "Someone filed a formal complaint with the Civilian Oversight Board." "Mercer?" "No, a bystander. Someone who was there with a phone and an opinion." Vance leaned back in his chair. "They recorded the entire encounter from start to finish. It's already circulating on social media. The local news picked it up this morning." Elena felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She had known the phones were out that day. She had seen them raised like weapons in the hands of the crowd, but she had not considered what those recordings might mean, not until this moment. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "I need you to stay quiet and let the process work. Don't contact the subject again. No calls, no messages, no attempts to apologize. Let legal handle any communication." Vance leaned forward, his eyes hard. "And I need you to understand something clearly, Shaw. This department doesn't need another headline. We don't need activists at our doorstep or reporters asking uncomfortable questions. If IA finds sufficient grounds for disciplinary action, that action will fall squarely on your shoulders. Not mine, not the department's, yours." "Oh." Elena met his gaze without flinching. "I followed protocol to the letter." "Protocol doesn't win cases in the court of public opinion," Vance replied. "Keep your head down, Captain. That's an order." She returned to her desk with the weight of the warning pressing against her shoulders like a physical burden. Her colleagues avoided eye contact as she passed. The station felt different, somehow quieter, more watchful. She had 2 choices now. She could stay quiet, let the review run its course, and hope the system would protect her the way it had always protected officers who followed proper procedure. Or she could do something else entirely. She pulled up the video that had been circulating online. She watched herself approach Daniel Mercer in that parking lot. She watched herself speak with authority and certainty. She watched herself place the handcuffs on a man who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time beside a van that happened to resemble another van. She watched him ask to make a phone call. She watched herself deny him, and in that moment, watching herself through the lens of a stranger's camera, she finally saw what everyone else had seen. Not a captain doing her job correctly, but a system failing a man who had spent his entire adult life protecting others. She closed the video. She opened a new document. She began typing a statement not for internal affairs, not for legal review, but for herself. A complete record of what had happened and what she had done. A record of the choices she had made and the ones she had failed to consider until it was too late. She did not know yet how she would use it. She only knew that staying silent was no longer an option she could live with. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Detective Paula Reyes had spent the past 6 months investigating a series of fraudulent vehicle reports filed within the department. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but consistent enough to suggest deliberate coordination. Someone inside the police department had been flagging vehicles that did not match the actual stolen inventory, triggering stops and detentions without legitimate cause. Daniel Mercer's arrest was one of 14 that fit the emerging pattern. Reyes brought her findings to Elena on a Tuesday afternoon, sliding into her office without announcement and closing the door behind her. "You were set up," she said without preamble, sliding a thick folder across Elena's desk. Not deliberately targeted, but the flag on that van wasn't a clerical error. It was planted in the system. Elena opened the folder with hands that were not quite steady. Inside were dispatch records, system access logs, financial documents, and a single name highlighted in yellow marker, Lieutenant Harold Vance. He's been running a side operation for at least 2 years, Reyes continued, her voice low but intense. Insurance fraud, mostly. Works with a tow company that profits from impounded vehicles. The false flags generate police stops. The stops generate paperwork and impound fees. And the fees get split between Vance and his partners. It's small scale enough to avoid triggering audits, but it adds up to serious money over time. Elena stared at the highlighted name, the man who had told her to stay quiet. The man who had warned her to let the system work. The man who had used her authority, her training, her willingness to follow orders to build his scheme. "Why are you bringing this to me?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're the one on camera. You're the one facing the IA review. You're the one who's going to take the fall if this stays buried." Reyes leaned forward. "And because you're the one who gets to decide what happens next." Elena looked at the folder again, at the evidence laid out in careful order. She thought about what Vance had said about headlines and optics, and keeping her head down. She thought about the way he had shifted blame onto her shoulders without a flicker of hesitation. She thought about Daniel Mercer, standing in that parking lot with his wrists behind his back, asking for one phone call that she had denied him. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "A statement. On the official record. About the stop, the flag, the dispatch information, and who gave you that information in the first place." That would directly implicate Vance. Yes, it would, and it would likely end my career. Reyes did not flinch or look away. "Maybe. Or maybe it would demonstrate that you're willing to hold the system accountable even when that system includes yourself." Elena sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had spent 18 years building her career in law enforcement. She had made captain at 39, one of the youngest in department history. She had believed, truly and deeply believed, that the rules existed to protect people, that following them faithfully was always the right thing to do. But the rules had not protected Daniel Mercer. The rules had been used to humiliate him in front of strangers, and the man who had written those rules, the man who had trained her to follow them without question, had been profiting from the damage all along. Elena picked up a pen from her desk. "Where do I sign?" Reyes handed her the witness statement form. Elena read it carefully, every word, then signed her name at the bottom in clear, deliberate letters. It was not redemption. It was not absolution. It was simply the first step toward something she had not allowed herself to consider until this moment: the truth, unvarnished and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. And the truth, she was beginning to understand, did not care about careers or headlines or the comfortable silence of those who benefited from looking the other way. The internal affairs hearing took place 3 weeks later in a windowless conference room on the 4th floor of the administration building. Elena Shaw sat at a long table facing a panel of 3 senior officers and a civilian oversight representative. The room was cold despite the heating system. A court reporter typed silently in one corner. A single camera recorded everything from a tripod near the door. She had been warned by her attorney not to speak beyond what was directly asked, to answer questions precisely and offer nothing extra. Her union representative sat beside her, ready to intervene if the questioning veered toward anything that might be considered entrapment or self-incrimination. But Elena had already made her decision long before entering that room. She would tell the complete truth. The panel began with the arrest itself. They asked about the vehicle flag, the timing of the stop, the decision to escalate to physical detention. Elena answered each question directly, without embellishment or excuse, her voice steady and clear. Then they asked about Lieutenant Vance. "Captain Shaw, Did Lieutenant Vance provide you with the dispatch information that led to the vehicle stop? Yes, he did. Were you aware at the time of the stop that the vehicle flag had been manually entered into the system by an internal user? No. I believed it was a legitimate match generated by the automated system. He's lying. And when exactly did you learn otherwise? Elena paused. She looked at the panel members, then at the camera's unblinking lens, then at her own hands resting flat on the table before her. I learned the truth when Detective Reyes brought me evidence that the flag was part of a larger pattern of fraudulent entries, a pattern that directly implicated Lieutenant Vance in a coordinated scheme involving insurance fraud and misuse of department resources. The room went completely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above the keyboard. The panel members exchanged glances laden with meaning. The civilian representative leaned forward in her chair. Captain Shaw, are you fully aware that this testimony may result in serious disciplinary action against a superior officer? Yes, I am. And you're prepared to proceed with this testimony regardless of the consequences? I am. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. Elena answered every question put to her with the same directness. She submitted the complete documentation that Detective Reyes had provided. She did not attempt to defend her own actions during the arrest. She did not minimize her role in what had happened to Daniel Mercer. She simply told the truth. When the panel adjourned for deliberation, her union representative turned to her with an expression of barely concealed disbelief. You know what you just did in there. Yes, I do. Apply. Vance has allies throughout the department, powerful ones who owe him favors. They're not going to let this go quietly. Elena gathered her papers and stood, her legs steadier than she had expected. I didn't do this to win, she said. I did it because a man was humiliated in public for something he didn't do, and the system that was supposed to protect him was used against him instead. She walked out of the hearing room into the bright afternoon light. Daniel Mercer was standing by the exit, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. He did not speak. He did not approach. He simply looked at her, the same quiet, steady gaze she remembered from that parking lot, though something in it had changed. Elena stopped a few feet away from him. You came, she said. I heard what you did in there. It doesn't change what happened. No, he agreed. But it changes what comes next. Once, they stood in silence for a moment. Two people who had met under the worst possible circumstances trying to find a way forward. I'm sorry, Elena said finally. For all of it. Daniel nodded slowly, considering her words. I know you are. The public hearing took place 6 weeks after Elena's testimony. Lieutenant Harold Vance sat at the defendant's table with 2 attorneys and an expression of controlled contempt that fooled no one in the gallery. The evidence against him had grown beyond the original fraud scheme. Bank records showing regular deposits from the tow company, wire transfers to offshore accounts, and testimony from 3 tow company operators who had been promised immunity in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation. The hearing room was packed to capacity. Reporters filled the back rows with notebooks and recording devices. Camera crews lined the walls. The story had become national news not primarily because of the fraud itself, but because of the police captain who had exposed it at the cost of her own career. Elena Shaw had become a symbol. She did not want to be one. She sat in the witness section, watching the proceedings unfold with a mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. The Civilian Oversight Board presented their findings in methodical detail. The prosecutors outlined each charge with documentary precision. Vance's attorneys objected, negotiated, and ultimately failed to prevent the inevitable. Guilty on 12 counts of insurance fraud. Guilty on 3 counts of official misconduct. Guilty on 1 count of obstruction of justice. The sentence would come later, but the verdicts were enough. Vance was escorted from the hearing room in handcuffs, the same type of restraints that had been placed on Daniel Mercer in a parking lot 8 weeks earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone present. After the hearing adjourned, Elena was called before the department's executive leadership. They offered her a commendation for her role in exposing the corruption. She declined. They offered her a promotion to fill the vacancy left by Vance's removal. She declined that too. Instead, she submitted her resignation from the command track. She requested a transfer to the Community Relations Division, a department with less authority, less visibility, and considerably less power. "You're giving up everything you spent 18 years working for," her colleague said when he heard the news. "No," Elena replied. "I'm giving up what I thought I wanted. What I actually worked for was supposed to mean something. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what that was." The next morning, she held a brief press conference outside the department building. She did not read from a prepared statement. She did not deflect questions with rehearsed answers. She stood in front of the cameras and the microphones and spoke plainly, as one person to another. "I made a mistake," she said. "I followed protocol instead of paying attention to the person standing in front of me. I treated a man like a suspect because the system told me to, and the system was corrupted. That doesn't excuse my actions. It only explains them." She paused, gathering herself. "To Daniel Mercer and his family, I am sorry. Not because it's expected. Not because it protects my career. Because it's true. I failed you. And I will spend the rest of my time in this uniform trying to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." She stepped away from the microphone without taking questions. Daniel was waiting by her car. "That took courage," he said. "It took too long." "Maybe. But you did it anyway." He hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand toward her. "I think we started wrong. I'm Daniel." Upset, Elena looked at his hand, the same hand she had cuffed behind his back 8 weeks ago in front of strangers with cameras. She took it. Elena. For the first time since the parking lot, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. And sometimes, possibility was enough to begin. The weeks after the hearing passed slowly, measured in small moments rather than dramatic events. Elena settled into her new role in community relations, with the quiet discipline of someone learning to rebuild from the ground up. There were no high-profile cases in this work, no tactical operations, no moments of authority that commanded respect. There were only conversations, long, patient, often difficult conversations, with people who had every reason to distrust the uniform she still wore. She listened more than she spoke. She learned more than she taught. And slowly, something inside her began to shift. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to his routine. Wake at 5:45, coffee by 6, leave by 6:30. The schedule had not changed in 9 years, but the man following it had begun to change in ways he was only beginning to understand. He found himself thinking about Elena more often than he expected, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something closer to curiosity, a quiet wonder at the kind of person who would sacrifice everything she had built to tell the truth about a stranger. 3 months after the public hearing, he sent her a message. It was brief, just a few lines asking if she would be willing to meet. He did not explain why. He was not entirely sure himself. She said yes. They met at a small coffee shop near the river, far from the department building, far from the places where either of them might be recognized. Daniel arrived first and chose a table near the window. Elena came 5 minutes later, out of uniform for the first time since he had known her. She looked different without the badge. Softer, somehow. More uncertain. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down. "Thank you for asking." As they said, they sat across from each other in silence for a moment. Two people who had met under the worst possible circumstances, trying to find something worth building. "I wanted to tell you something," Daniel said finally. "Something I should have said before." You don't owe me anything, I know. But I want to say it anyway." He paused, gathering his words carefully. "When you cuffed me in that parking lot, I wasn't angry at you. I was terrified. Not of you, of what would happen to Sophie if I didn't get home on time. I had spent 9 years making sure she never had to wait alone for me. And in that moment, I thought I had failed her." Elena's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. "What you did afterward, the testimony, the resignation, the public apology, it didn't erase what happened. Nothing could do that. But it showed me something I had stopped believing was possible. What? That people can change. That broken systems can be challenged. That doing the right thing still matters, even when it costs everything. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm still learning what the right thing looks like, she admitted. I spent so long following rules that I forgot to ask whether the rules were worth following in the first place. Maybe that's the point, Daniel said. Maybe we're not supposed to have it all figured out. Maybe we're just supposed to keep trying. Oh, they talked for 2 hours that afternoon about work, about loss, about the children who depended on them to get it right. By the time they left the coffee shop, something had changed between them. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of trust. And trust, Daniel had learned, was the only foundation worth building on. 1 year later, Elena stood in Daniel's kitchen, watching his daughter Sophie pour cereal into a bowl with the focused concentration of a 9-year-old who had perfected her morning routine down to the smallest detail. The house was small but warm, filled with the quiet evidence of a life built on consistency and care. Photographs covered the refrigerator door. A detailed schedule was pinned to the wall by the phone. A single pair of worn work boots sat by the back door, their leather softened by years of faithful use. Daniel stood at the counter with coffee in hand, watching the two of them with an expression Elena had come to recognize over the past months. It was the look of a man who had learned to hope again carefully, cautiously, but genuinely. You're staring, Elena said, not looking up from the newspaper on the table. I know. It's a little weird. I know that too. He's not Bernard. Sophie looked up from her cereal with the exasperated expression only a 9-year-old could manage. Are you two going to be mushy again? Because I have school, and I don't need that in my morning. Daniel laughed, a sound Elena had not heard often in those first difficult months, but had come to treasure in the time since. No mushiness, he promised. Go brush your teeth. Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically and disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Elena turned to Daniel. You're sure about this? About me? About us? After everything? Daniel set down his coffee and crossed the kitchen to where she stood. He took her hands in his, gently, deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered. A year ago, you put me in handcuffs in front of a crowd of strangers, he said quietly. You humiliated me without knowing who I was or what I had lost. You followed rules that were supposed to protect people, and used them to hurt someone who had done nothing wrong. Elena flinched, but she did not pull away. And then, Daniel continued, you did something I didn't think was possible. You looked at what you had done, really looked at it. You told the truth about it when lying would have been easier. You gave up everything you had built to make sure it never happened again. He paused. That's not the action of someone who can't be trusted. That's the action of someone who finally understands what trust actually means. Elena's eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Maybe not, he agreed. But that's not how this works. We don't earn the people who love us. We just try every day to be worthy of them. He pulled her close, and she let him. Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows across the small backyard. Sophie's voice echoed from the bathroom, singing off-key to a song only she knew. The coffee on the counter grew cold, and in that small kitchen, in that ordinary house, two people who had met in the worst possible way found something they had both stopped looking for. Not perfection, not easy forgiveness. Just the quiet, stubborn belief that broken things could still be made whole if you were willing to do the work. Daniel kissed her forehead. No more handcuffs, he said. Elena smiled through her tears. No more handcuffs. If this story reminded you that justice can heal, and that second chances are worth fighting for, share it with someone who needs to believe that today. Sometimes, the right story at the right moment can change everything. The morning continued in its unhurried rhythm. Sophie returned from the bathroom with toothpaste still visible at the corner of her mouth. Daniel wiped it away with his thumb, a small gesture. Automatic. The kind of thing fathers do without thinking. Bus comes in 12 minutes, Sophie announced, checking the clock on the wall. I know, Daniel said. I'm never late, remember? I know you're never late. I'm just making sure Elena knows you're never late. Elena laughed, a genuine sound that still surprised her sometimes. I've figured that out by now. How? Sophie studied her for a moment with the uncanny perceptiveness children sometimes possess. You used to be a cop, right? The one who arrested my dad? The kitchen went quiet. Daniel started to intervene, but Elena held up her hand. Yes, she said simply. I was. And now you're his girlfriend. Yes. Sophie considered this information, her expression unreadable. That's weird. It is, Elena agreed. But sometimes weird things turn out okay. Is gone? Sophie nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with this answer. She grabbed her backpack from the hook by the door and headed for the front porch. Already watching for the yellow bus at the end of the street, Daniel turned to Elena when they were alone. You didn't have to answer her. Yes, I did. She deserves the truth. Everyone does. Elena paused. That's what I learned from all this. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always necessary. Who are dying. He pulled her close one more time, and they stood together in the morning light, two imperfect people who had somehow found their way to each other through the wreckage of a broken system. Outside, the bus appeared at the corner. Sophie waved from the porch without turning around. Daniel smiled. 3:15, he said quietly. 3:15, Elena replied. I'll be here. And she meant it, not as a promise she might break, but as a commitment forged in the fire of everything they had survived together. Some stories end with dramatic declarations. This one ended with something quieter, with a man who was never late and a woman who had finally learned what it meant to show up when it mattered. The bus pulled away. The morning light grew stronger. And in a small house on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, two people who had every reason to be strangers chose instead to become family. That, in the end, was the real justice, not the courtroom kind. The kind that happens when people decide to be better than their worst moments and mean it.